The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the 5th webinar in a joint Linear and CPC Learning Network webinar series. The webinar series is profiling the most innovative research and practice on social norms and the prevention of all forms of violence, exploitation and abuse of children and adolescents. My name is Lottie Howard-Merrill and I'm the Research Assistant for Linear, or the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation and Abuse, which sits within the Gender Violence and Health Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Linear is an international and multi-pronged project exploring how social norm theory can be used to prevent the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and adolescents globally. Linear also hosts a network of partners in research, programming, policy, advocacy and funding who are using a social norms approach to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse of young people. We're thrilled to be co-hosting the webinar series with the Care and Protection of Children Learning Network, housed at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in New York City. The CPC Learning Network convenes academics, policymakers and practitioners to promote innovative research, nurture communities of learning and build the next generation of researchers and advocates for the children and families worldwide. So today's webinar, as you can see, is entitled "The Body is a Sexual Object Right? Community Perceptions of Transactional Sex as Children and Adolescents, a Qualitative Study in Favelas of Rio de Janeiro." We have two hosts for today's webinar who I'm going to introduce briefly before handing over to them. So the first is Linda Cerdeira, who is currently the Program Coordinator of Instituto Promundo in Brazil. She has 15 years of experience in socio-cultural projects in Portugal and Brazil, and she's a specialist in the development, monitoring and evaluation of transformative gender program methodologies. The second presenter is Carolina Ignacio, who is the Research Monitoring and Evaluation Coordinator also at Instituto Promundo in Brazil. Her PhD research focused on promoting people-centered care and addressing the social determinants of health in primary healthcare in urban communities of Rio de Janeiro. So the presentation today is going to last about 35 minutes and we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So we warmly welcome you to use the chat box on your screen to enter questions to the presenters during the presentation and then also during the Q&A. We're hoping to have a really lively discussion after what promises to be a fascinating presentation. Okay, so I'll hand over to the presenters now.
Hi Lottie, thank you for the presentation. As Lottie said, I'm Program Coordinator at Instituto Promundo in Brazil. Some of you might know Instituto Promundo from our previous work. Promundo works as a consortium member with offices in Brazil, in the United States, DRC and Portugal, and we have partners all around the globe. And we started in '97 in Rio de Janeiro, understanding how gender norms can associate with violent behaviors and health. Today, our programs are adapted in different contexts in more than 20 countries around the world, and we have conducted researches in more than 50 countries all around the globe. So our approach is understanding that men and boys are also victims of gender norms and social expectations around gender perspectives and gender and social norms. And we understand them not as being inherently violent, and with that we know that we can promote changes of behaviors and of those norms through research, programming and advocacy. So we try to involve all men and boys as allies with women and girls to promote these changes in behavior. So from our different focused areas, we try to relate them with these social norms, how they play a crucial role in influencing several aspects of our society development and forms of relation. And one of them is obviously sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, SECA. So we were invited to join this program, this Linea initiative, and to help them perform this research specifically here in Rio de Janeiro. So Promundo has already an historical of programs, campaigns, and researches in Brazil focused on this theme of sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. And with this, we've been learning how the community, civil society leaders in Rio understand what's their perspectives and what are the community perspectives. And so we've learned already in the last 10 years that we usually identify that men have preference of young female bodies for sex. We understand that the responsibility is often placed on adolescents in order to avoid adult responsibility for any kind of sexual violence or in a less correct sexual behavior. Often we find as well blaming the family of the child or of the girl. The perception that male sexuality cannot be controlled, that is an instinct, and with that offering of sex as a help can support that girl that in many situations is already in other violent situation at home or in her community, and that sees this as an opportunity of way out. We did also a big research focused specifically on commercial sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in 4 Brazilian cities in different states, which reinforced that SACA is more tolerated with older children and adolescents compared with the young ones, which is deeply related with the perceptions of the body development and a perspective of being ready for sex. Boys under 18 are more likely to be blamed, and people perceive them as having more agency than girls to decide to participate in sex work. And the community and often understands as well that it's not sexual exploitation, but it's helping or supporting the girls. And some of the notions is that men should always be available for sex, and men will always want to have sex in any situation, and that they cannot control themselves, and that women and girls control sex, and girls who offer sex are liable and irresponsible. Generally, we know that sex is not unanimously defined, but some of the forms of sex obviously include exchange of sexual favors, child pornography, sexual tourism, and human trafficking. This qualitative study specifically focused on age disparity transactional sex in urban favelas in some communities of Rio de Janeiro, in 3 communities of Rio de Janeiro, between adult men, this means men over 18, and girls under 18, involving a minimum of 5-year age disparity. And this focus, not only from the previous research we did before we go to the field, but also in 2015 we conducted the first study in Brazil focused on child and adolescent marriage, which again brought us lots of information. And one of the things that we found out is this focus, this understanding of transactional sex, and the difficulty of the community to understand this as a form of exploitation of these girls. So now I'm going to give the word to Carol, that will explain a little bit the specificities of this research aims and objectives.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here on this webinar. So our general aim was to uncover social norms that justify and or foster the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in the research sites and measure their prevalence. So as you can see here, our objectives were map the reference groups for adults, for adolescents, and for the protection network, describe norms that may place children at risk and norms that may protect them from the sexual exploitation, explore attitudes and behaviors that reinforce SECA, and also to generate item pools on SECA to develop a scale so that we can measure the social norms around sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. Next slide, please, Linda. Also, to examine the psychometric properties of the SECA measurement, assess internal consistency of the scale, assess the construct validity of the scale, estimate the prevalence of risk and protective norms around SECA, and identify factors associated with risk and protective norms around SECA. So as was mentioned earlier, today we're going to focus mostly on the qualitative phase of the study since we are still developing the scale and since we are still analyzing the quantitative data. So for this presentation, we're going to focus on what norms, and in particular, what gender norms are in place in the favelas that justify and or foster the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, what norms exist in the communities that could protect children and adolescents, and more broadly, what are the patterns of SECAs as they relate to gender, social exclusion, power dynamics, race, and other characteristics in these areas. That is, who does it, where does it occur, and how. So the study areas. So we focus on Rio de Janeiro city, in Rio de Janeiro state in Brazil. The city is divided into northern, southern, western, and central zones. So the qualitative phase of the study, which we're highlighting here, was conducted between July and September of last year in 3 favelas or groupings of favelas, one in this northern zone that you can see in blue, one in the south, which is in yellow, one in the west in green. So favelas are socially, politically, and economically vulnerable communities that are common in urban areas like Rio de Janeiro. To select our study areas, the communities, they were selected according to their geographical location in the city, like I mentioned before, representing the west, north, and south. Their score on the adaptation of the Social Vulnerability Index, which is a scale that ranges from 0, which is the absence of social vulnerability, to 1, which is the worst situation of vulnerability. And this aims to help support us. This index is used to help support planning at the very local levels, and it's constructed using a mix of urban infrastructure and human capital indicators. So in these, the areas that we ended up selecting was Cidade de Deus, which is in the western area, Complexo de Maré, which is a group of favelas in the northern zone, and Rocinha in the southern zone. So additionally, since previous research has shown important associations between exposure to urban violence and less equitable gender norms, the 3 communities were selected for their frequent episodes of urban violence and their temporary occupations by Brazilian military or permanent occupations through the establishment of Rio State pacifying police units. So here I've included when the pacifying police units were established, and Maré, which did not have a pacifying police unit during this period, was occupied by the Brazilian military forces. So in each community, non-probability purposive sampling through snowball method was used. Community mobilizers were recruited, and they helped us to identify participants through civil society projects, resident associations, and other community organizations in the territories. Men, women, boys, and girls, and community residents from 15 to 65 years old were eligible to participate in the qualitative study. And our final example included 130 residents. We conducted 30 semi-structured interviews and 10 focus groups in total, and each focus group contained an average of 10 participants. So the topic guide for focus groups and interviews was developed according to the literature on the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, consultation with leading experts in the field, and previous meetings with key stakeholders such as community leaders and members of grassroots organizations from the territories and from outside the territories. And the topic guide included vignettes which simulated discussion on transactional sex. We decided to use this style because it helped us. We've had good experience with people being more open when we use these small stories instead of asking them directly about their relationships and their history or of those in their community. So the analysis of the transcripts and the field notes for each focus group and interview was conducted manually by at least 2 members of the research team. We open coded, compared codes, and identified the categories. and the categories were grouped within the themes and thematic inquiry framework, and additional themes were identified from these categories. So we specifically looked for the social norms, the reference groups, and emergent sub-themes. So our major findings. We identified a variety of social norms related to transactional sex, which emphasize the complexity and dynamic nature of SECA in these urban communities. The norms focus on expectations involving girls and men in regards to age-disparate transactional sexual relationships. So we were able to classify these. Into major categories. So age-disparate transactional sex in the context of drug trafficking, community perceptions of girls and their motivations for engaging in age-disparate transactional sex, girls' readiness for sex and agency, community perceptions of men and their motivations for age-disparate transactional sex, the appeal of drug traffickers, so this was identified as promoting factor, protection by drug traffickers, so traffickers also had a role in preventing these types of relationships, and a generalized climate of fear, plus women's fear specifically in these communities. So we saw that areas containing organized drug trafficking, which was all of the favelas in our study, they may be considered territories with parallel rules to that ruling the rest of the country, which in turn affects age-disparate transactional sex. It's possible to glean from our results that the men involved in drug trafficking were expected to also be involved in these relationships, but this is because they represented a group with access to money, to drugs, to power, and all of these factors were perceived by the participants as posing an allure to the girls, particularly due to their symbolic and political and economic power. But at the same time, these men were seen as possible protective forces because girls, or possibly their families, could turn to them and ask for help for punishing men that were involved in SECA. And this was particularly the case when there was a very large age difference between the girl and the man. So they saw that drug traffickers were more likely to intervene to punish these men if they were much older than the girls. So while the power that involvement in drug trafficking may bring to these men may be appealing to girls, it also created an environment of fear among the community members who are conditioned to not question or even discuss practices related to drug trafficking. Fear was seen to limit girls' ability to refuse or leave these relationships in general, even more so if they were involved with the traffickers. Additionally, drug trafficking added to a climate of conflict between the traffickers, rival factions, and the police or military that were present in these territories. And this produced a sort of generalized fear in the community, which promoted silence and non-interference in both girls' relationships with traffickers and in their relationship with any older man. So there is a sense of you don't get involved in other people's business. It's important to note that fear was more often associated with age-disparate transactional sex when the men were involved in trafficking, but was not exclusive to these men. And that fear was predominantly brought up by girls and or young women who were involved in the qualitative phase. So although one man reported the need to remain silent in certain matters, it was mostly women who reinforced their fear to speak out. So the community, here we're looking at the community perceptions of girls and their motivations. The community saw young girls' bodies as a source of pleasure for men and believed that girls use their bodies as a means to exert their autonomy and agency, since the girls willingly decided to participate in transactional sex in the view of the community members. The perception around girls' motivations for participating in these relationships were based on the community's belief that the girls are the deciding agents with ultimate control regarding the relationship's existence. The girls also perceived the difference in responsibility and maturity conferred to them compared to the boys. So they often mentioned that even though they were at the same age as the boys, they were held much more accountable for their actions than the boys were. And we've seen this throughout the literature in other parts of the world as well. But in contrast with other groups, their increased maturity was seen by the girls themselves as a burden instead of as a power. Overall, the participants believed that girls became involved in age-disparate transactional sex because they expected it would confer increased status in relation to perceptions of their maturity level and increased stability, be it emotional or financial. So in lots of the focus groups and the interviews, the focus wasn't so much on the financial stability that it conferred to the girls, although that was present, but more on the emotional stability and the respect. Sex in exchange for material goods Including the drugs did appear, though, as an important perceived motivation for girls who enter these relationships, which, once again, they were not interpreted as exploitative by the community members. The community members' perception of girls' choice to participate in sexual relationships with men was also a result of injunctive norms, where pressure from other girls, especially their friends, which were identified as the primary reference group for the girls, and even family members who wanted girls to be in stable relationships, was an important motivator for girls to engage in these relationships. So in terms of the profile of the girls believed to engage in age-disparate transactional sex, generally the participants found the participation of girls under 12 in these sexual relationships with adult men more unacceptable than 14 to 17-year-old girls. But these distinctions were extremely fluid, so it really depended more on visible physical markers of puberty than the girl's age. The majority of the participants highlighted the importance of the girls' bodies, so how developed the body was, how the body was dressed, or where the body was seen, in determining the acceptability of age-disparate transactional sex. So, for example, if the girl was seen to be in a baile, which is like community party, then it was seen to be more acceptable for her to be involved in these relationships. Attached to the notion of girls' bodies was that of clothing. So references to the girls' choices in terms of clothing were consistently present throughout participants' accounts and across the communities. They usually described clothing choices as visual signals that were emitted by the girls that showed their interests, showed they were served as manifestations of the girls' autonomy. These signals were interpreted to denote the girl's entrance into new life stages, for example, adolescence, and her desire to get men's attention and ultimately her consent in terms of men's sexual advances. So it was very important that rarely did the community members talk about the girls' verbal consent, but they used these signals of consent that the girls supposedly emitted. Like I mentioned before, the bailes are these traditional party areas in Rio with music, and these were seen as places where it was socially acceptable for these relationships to occur, but also rooftops, which are often used in Rio for barbecues and parties and sunbathing. They were also an area that people mentioned that if the girls are frequenting these spaces, then it's because they want these types of relationships. So there's an expectation that young people will go to these spaces as part of a lifestyle of young favela residents. And for girls specifically, their participation in these spaces serves as a means of conforming to the norms of their reference group to avoid social isolation. So although attending these spaces implied that the girls were consenting to participate in sexual activity, there was also a lot of pressure for the girls to go there. On the other hand, involvement in churches or social educational projects in the territories were expected to protect the girls from these relationships. So the involvement of adult men in age-disparate transactional sex was strongly related to what was expected of them as a natural biological response in relation to young girls' bodies. Men from a young age were expected to attempt to conquer younger girls and also to conquer as many girls as possible. So normalizing simplistic binary stereotypes regarding behavior based on sex were present in the social norms regarding gender and childhood when discussing motivations for participating in these relationships. So on the one hand, while there was an assumption that girls naturally mature faster than boys and become what participants termed as interesseras, or calculating and self-serving, on the other hand, boys and men are considered innocent because they act upon uncontrollable biological impulses, even in adulthood. So men's behavior was seen as more acceptable and easily forgiven compared to girls' behavior. Also, men believed that to exercise their heterosexuality, it had to be characterized as viral, as a video. I think it's viral in English, and controlling, and they must perform public conquest of young girls' bodies, which in turn the community members expected for them to do. So the only time that we noticed that these expectations were not present was when the men were much older, and this was usually considered much older when it was about 40 years old or older with an adolescent girl, or when the girls were exceptionally young, so in the eyes of the community, under 12 and with an not a very developed body. However, this, like I said before, it was very unclear exactly what age the girls were no longer seen as children. And furthermore, the girls were expected to not react to men's public advances unless they intended to get sexually involved. So if a man catcalled a young girl in the street and she responded in any way, they would consider that as a form of consent as well. There was just one really important contradiction in how the men involved in these relationships with girls were seen. So although at times they were considered stallions and seen very positively among their peers for conquering these young girls, at other moments they were seen as fools, especially by the younger boys, since it was interpreted that the girls were taking advantage of the men. The girls were using the men for their money, going back to how the girls were seen as the ones with agency in these relationships. So the second interpretation of the men who participate in these types of relationships was particularly present among the younger boys and men. So in highlighting, the socialization of children supports the perceptions of transactional sex as normal. Like I mentioned before, boys were taught and expected that to be men, they had to exert their sexuality and conquer as many girls and as young as possible. Social norms discouraged outside direct interference in transactional sex. Communities are decisive in the acceptance and replication of these relationships. Structural factors contribute to transactional sex by limiting the girls' choices. So although, like I mentioned earlier, the men were not depicted as having a say, as choosing these relationships, the burden was placed on the girls to have chosen them, but also some people recognize that girls did not have many other options of accessing emotional, financial stability. Próximo. So in developing the scale, like I said, we're still, we won't present the results of this part yet, but we'll talk a little bit about how the scale was being developed. So to develop the scale, the research team, we still don't have an exact name for the scale, but as here we're putting it for the sexual exploitation norms scale. But the purpose will be to measure how supportive or tolerant or how resistant the social norms are in a community to these types of relationships. The principal findings from phase 1 were presented in a table with the following headings. So the possible domain, the participants, so who said it, the primary reference group, the main finding, the category. So here we categorize them as norms, expectations, motivations, or sanctions related to age-disparate transactional sex, and when available, if the finding promoted or prevented ATS. During an in-person meeting between the project partners here in Rio de Janeiro, these findings were discussed and items were brainstormed. From there, the operational definitions of the construct and key domains of the construct were discussed. So the initial domains that we identified were benefits of age-disparate transactional sex, male behaviors and desires, male responsibility and assets, outside reactions to ATS, and girls' responsibility and agency. So during this phase, the content validity of each item was evaluated. Content validity is the degree to which an item of an instrument represents the domain of the construct that it was evaluated. So we used a panel of experts to evaluate this. There were 14 who were invited, 14 who participated, and these experts were invited based on their experience with the construct and motivation to collaborate with the development of the scale. We prioritized inviting authors that we identified in the lit review with the most relevant works and contacts within our professional networks, especially within Linea. We needed at least 4 experts to perform analysis but obviously the greater the number of experts available, the more comprehensive it was. So to evaluate the content domain representation, the domain experts are required to rate the adequacy of the test items. So we use clarity, relevance, and importance as our main criteria for evaluating. Excuse me. The selected items then were translated into Brazilian Portuguese, and so 2 people with experience in English-Portuguese translation did this translation, and then we had a whole process for retro translations to make sure that they were equivalent. The items were used to develop questions addressing personal attitudes and social norms. So the personal attitudes questions used the items with the beginning of "you think that," and then whatever the item was, and had the following answer options. So totally agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and totally disagree. For the social norms questions, we use the same items, but we started with how many people in your community think that, and then the item. And the options were everyone, the majority, half, a few, and no one. We also added some questions regarding individual characteristics, household characteristics, and behaviors. 2 versions of the questionnaire were prepared and pre-tested. So in the end, there were 41 total final items. Originally, we had intended to apply the questionnaire in 2 of the 3 communities where the qualitative phase was conducted, so specifically Rocinha and Cidade de Deus, so the communities in the western zone and the southern zone. However, due to increased frequency of episodes of armed conflict and subsequent difficulty in reaching the participants, we decided to move forward with the quantitative phase of the study in Parque União, which is one of the communities within the Complexo de Maré, where the qualitative study was collected as well. So this is part of the northern zone. And in a different favela in the southern zone. In the southern zone, we identified a few possibilities, calculated their adapted social vulnerability index, discussed with our contacts the current situation in the communities to make sure that we could actually enter, and then we selected to go with Babilônia and Chapéu Mangueira. So from these communities, 412 people participated in the quantitative phase. Now the psychometric characteristics of the scale are being evaluated using data collected from the sample of these 2 communities. Descriptive statistical analysis was performed for the whole scale, as well as for each item of the scale. Convex alpha is being employed to evaluate the scale's internal consistency, correct item total correlation, and internal consistency. If the items are being employed to determine, it's to evaluate the psychometric characteristics of the individual items. And finally, we're conducting exploratory factor analysis to evaluate the loading coefficient of each item in the structure of the scale. So that's basically where we are now, and hopefully we will have those results soon to share with everyone as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation, both of you, Linda and Caroline. We're encouraging the participants now to type your questions into the question box, and we've got a few coming through already. But I thought I'd kickstart by asking, it's possible that there are some people listening to this webinar now who are thinking of developing a similar scale to measure social norms. So I was wondering, seeing as you've been steeped in this research and the process of developing the scale, what are the key learning points that you have, and what would you recommend to other people who are embarking on a similar project?
So for us, it was very important, and I think the hardest part was actually identifying the items and the wording of the items. So this was a very collaborative process. We had the entire team together from the UK, from the US, from Brazil, and we discussed it over several days, tested different formulations, because it's important that the items really do reflect the qualitative findings, but that they're also useful for the scale. So although we started with over 60 items for the pre-test, we quickly narrowed it down to 41, and right now for the scale, we're seeing that probably some of these will be dropped as well.
Great, thanks. Linda, would you like to add anything, or should we go on to the next question?
Yeah. And we are at this moment we are trying to understand, because obviously one thing is using this specific context of favelas in Rio de Janeiro, that we know it's very specific, and obviously, as Caroline mentioned, the influence of drug trafficking and the armed violence in these territories is very, very significant. But we know that specifically considering that we want to be able to use this scale in as many different contexts as we can, probably something that is really, really significant here, and that was appeared a lot in the results, may not make sense in the final scale to be used. So now we are making this kind of discussions and understanding what we need to take out from the scale, considering a scale to be applied in different contexts, and at the same time, how not to leave that from the side and make sure that this, in the analysis of Rio, that this clearly appears as being a very strong item considering sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, specifically considering transactional sex, age-disparate transactional sex.
We're trying to figure out how to best have a scale that is appropriate for our context, that's specific to where it was developed, Rio de Janeiro, but also have one that can be adapted in other areas. So one of the possibilities that we're discussing but haven't fully decided yet is having a smaller core scale that can be applied hopefully in many places, and then having additional like sub-packets, I guess, where you can apply depending on your area. So for example, like Linda mentioned, for us, violence and drug trafficking and police, this scenario was very, very important for our research, which might not be the case in other areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. I was going to ask you about the transferability to alternative settings, but you've kind of answered that question already. So I'll turn to some of the participants. So we have Anjan has asked a number of questions. The first one is, was the research also considering age-disparate transactional sex with younger boys? And then they've also asked, did you look much at how the girls were related to the men who they were in relationships, and I suppose what their relationship consisted of apart from their transactional sex act itself?
Okay, so first, considering answering to the first question, considering the younger boys, at the beginning of the research, we wanted to go after that, especially because we know that boys often stay invisible in this kind of discussion, and we know that this kind of relationships also happen involving them. But at this moment, we weren't able to do this in this scale. It needed to be for all types of reason, logistics, financing, time, and background. We needed to have another structure to involve all of them. We would love to do this as continuity of this research, focused also on younger boys, but we hadn't the opportunity to do it in this one, and that's why we focused on girls.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, in terms of the relationships of the girls with the men, we did not see, or at least it wasn't referred to in the qualitative section, relationships among girls and extended family members, for example, or distant relatives. It was mostly seen as men that were not in the family. And something that I didn't mention, because we're still testing the quantitative phase, but that was mentioned qualitatively, was that it seems like the role of the family was particularly important when we were talking about religious families, more conservative families were more likely to push or to encourage girls to have relationships with older men in the expectation that the girls would marry. So that was something that we're also still analyzing now.
Great, thank you so much. So Amy Jones has asked, what's the reason that you were only looking at men's perspectives in the scales? But was it correct that you were interviewing girls as well?
Yes, we did interview girls as well. So it was girls, boys, women, and men.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Hannah, and she's asking, do the girls and boys who are participating in these relationships use a specific term to describe the transactional nature of these relationships? And then she's also gone on to ask, how did you come to choose the terminology you are using to describe these relationships? For example, age-disparate transactional sex. So it's a question of the language from the participants and yourselves.
Sorry. So they didn't seem to have a specific term for these types of relationships, but they did call the girls in many cases interesadas, which I mentioned, which implies they're interested people, I guess, be an appropriate translation, which really reinforced this notion that the girls are the ones who decide, the girls are the ones who I guess, promote these relationships, which this was held among the community members. So obviously the girls themselves did not agree with this view at all, and they questioned why they're always considered responsible when the boys their age are not considered as responsible. But for the relationships themselves, a term wasn't identified. And we decided to use age-disparate transactional sex based on the literature. We saw that there are many different terms used, but we felt like this was the one that fit the best and that we most often saw in the lit review.
Great, thank you. We now have a question from Huda, who's asking, she says, thank you very much for the presentation. And knowing that sexual exploitation is often linked to a situation of dependency and vulnerability and power relations, how much would you say transactional sex was related to a lack of financial benefits? I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but maybe you can expand on that a bit further.
Yeah, that was something that appeared a lot from the different groups interviewed and from the different focus groups that seen as justification of the girls to leave a violent situation at home, to be able to have some kind of financial support or situation and material goods that she wouldn't have with her family. So being as an exit to a previous violent situation is something that appeared a lot. And as Carol mentioned, specifically considering the more conservative families and more religious families, was something seen as preventing the girls to get pregnant by going around in the bailes or going around with the kids and getting pregnant. So with the families would prefer to deliver the girl to an older man that has a job, and then they can be sure that she will get pregnant of him and he will support her and their baby. This was something that we had already listened a lot in the child and adolescent marriage research we did, and here it appeared again very strongly. And also in the go ahead.
Specifically, it was so that they wouldn't get pregnant while not married, and there was this expectation that older men were more likely to marry the girls, although we haven't seen that in our research. In our findings, but there was this expectation among the family members that if she were with an older man, he would be more stable and would marry her, and everyone recognized that boys and men we're supposed to try to get as many girls as possible. So this older man would probably have already gotten that out of his system, let's say.
Because Brazil has a huge problem of fatherhood recognition. So you have thousands and thousands of children that have only their mother's name on the registration. Some years ago, even we had a national campaign for stimulate fathers to register their children and recognize them, and hopefully give them some kind of support. So this is a big problem. At the same time, you have a huge problem with adolescent pregnancy, and you have a huge problem of lack of recognition and responsibilization from the fathers. So this is something that families really fear, that their daughters will get pregnant and they will have to support them and their babies because the man will not do it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's super interesting and relevant in many contexts. Amy Jones has wanted to clarify the question she asked earlier, and she was asking about the scale items. And sorry, I thought she was asking whether you only interviewed men, but she was actually asking whether there was a focus on like men's desires in these relationships, and whether you asked women about their desires in transactional sex relationships, or whether it was just seen as women's responsibility rather than something she might desire.
The scale items, they included questions that were focused on men's behavior, but also on girls. Then, like I mentioned before with the domains, there was a part on girls' responsibility and agency. So to what extent do people believe that it's the girl's responsibility and agency, we believe will be very important. And also to what extent do they believe that male behaviors are based mostly on their desires. Those were two key points that came from the qualitative study that we tried to incorporate into the scale.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
And also the girl, sorry, and also just adding that, and also the girls' motivations, not only their agency, but we also consider girls' motivations to appear in this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so Hannah's asked if you looked at the involvement of a diverse range of people according to their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and their sex characteristics. So so yeah, she's asking about the different types of people who are represented in the study.
So for our qualitative study, we didn't filter participants by sexual orientation, but our focus of our questions were mostly based on these heteronormative young girls and older men, which is a limitation of the reach, but we had to, like Linda mentioned earlier, for multiple reasons, focused on a particular section of the population and a particular problem.
In our early stage design of the research, we had designed it to involve specifically a group of LGBTI group in the focus group and for the interviews. But then for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, and also for safety reasons, because we would do it with under 18, and this inside favelas exposing your sexual orientation might be a risk factor. And because we were living from the last 2 years till now, the safety environment and the violence in Rio have escalated a lot, specifically in these communities. So we thought this could be a risk factor, and in the end, we decided to focus at this moment only to focus in this more heteronormative relationship between men and girls.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so Natasha is asking about interventions. What do you think are the implications for interventions from this work?
Okay, so yeah. So one of our goals now, it's not only analyzing the results and do some mixed method compare analysis, and to get to this scale that can be used in different contexts. But we also want to do some recommendations. To do an intervention, at least in the way that we do it in Promundo, we would need more time to perform, to test it, to properly test it with the different groups in the different areas, analyze it, and then go back to do the intervention, at least 3 months to consider the impact, and then do the impact evaluation. So it's something that would need to be longer. So what we want to do is, based on our previous programs and experiences, and in the data that we have now, considering these different groups, to prepare some recommendations of activities or different kinds of actions that can be done to approach this subject inside the communities.
Great, thanks very much. And Anjan asked a really interesting and important question about the information you collected about the research participants, and they've specifically mentioned film and video, for example. But maybe we can expand this out to more how your ethical considerations when carrying out the research, considering it's such a sensitive subject, and how the measures that you took to keep your research participants safe.
Yeah. So, well, we have the consent form, and it's totally anonymous. All those who answer, we try to do it very, very carefully, and this is one of the reasons that it takes us a really long time to collect all the data, because sometimes you have everything ready to do an interview, but suddenly something is happening in the community and it's not safe, nor for the interviewers, not for those who will be interviewed. So we had to reschedule. So we try always to do it in safe places, and for this we have our local contacts that, as an example, with the girls, they would take them in areas where we could talk with them safely, and then they would help us to take them back home. So we try not to expose anyone. And their families, with the under 18, their families always had to sign the permissions as well. And so we have no public pictures or videos or so. So we always try to keep it as anonymous as possible.
Great. And I've just thought, looking at this question again, I think Anjan was also asking about whether in these transactional sex relationships, adults are gaining video footage of the younger girls, and how that might be used in the future. Did you get a sense of whether this was happening in the qualitative research? So, for example, the older man taking video or photographs of the younger girl.
I'm not sure I understood your question, but for ours, we did not videotape the focus groups or the interviews. We just did audio recordings, and the transcripts did not include any identifying information except for the age range of the participants in the group and their gender.
About the man filming the girls, we didn't specifically ask that question. It might appear in some of the conversations, not directly filming the girls, but during the conversation, like mentioning that man liked to be in the bar drinking and watching videos of the novinhas, as they call them, that are the young girls. But we did not specifically enter in that kind of question.
Thank you. Okay, so we're just coming to the final questions now. One person has asked where the research is published and whether it can find the full text. As I understand, you're still in the process of.
So the qualitative phase, we have written up an article and submitted it, and we're awaiting to know if it was approved or not. So hopefully that will be available soon. The quantitative phase, like I said, we're still in analysis, and as soon as that's available, we would be happy to share both articles with the CPC Learning Network and as well as with Linya.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. We're drawing to a close now, but we've put the contact details of both the Linya and CPC Learning Network on the page. And what we're going to do is we're going to send out a recording of this webinar to everyone attended. So one person's asked if they can have the slide, but we'll just send you the webinar recording. We're also going to post the recording of the webinar on our YouTube page, and you can see all the previous Linya and CPC Learning Network webinars on our YouTube channel as well. So that's all there. So yes, I just want to finish by saying thank you so much to Linda and Caroline, and yeah, good luck with the last stages of the scale development.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure sharing our work with everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.